There is a particular sound a rifle makes when a stranger's hand closes around the wrong part of it. Not a click, not a snap, a dull scrape of skin against old steel, a sound no drill sergeant ever teaches you to expect, and no ceremony ever prepares the crowd to hear. I heard it at 11 minutes past 2 on a bright gray afternoon in the forecourt of the Harrowgate Palace, and in the half-second that followed, I did the only thing 40 years of discipline had left me able to do. Nothing. I will tell you the rest, because people have asked me 100 times since, and because the versions that travel from mouth to mouth are always wrong. They make it heroic. They make it fast and clean and cinematic, a single motion, a flash of trained hands, a thug on the cobblestones and a rifle back on the shoulder before the crowd could finish gasping. That last part is true. It was over before most of them understood it had begun. But heroism is not what happened in me during those seconds. What happened in me was the opposite of heroism. It was the deliberate, practiced, exhausting refusal to do the 10 easy things so that I could do the one hard thing. My name is Aldous Vane. For 19 years I have stood the king's post at the outer gate of the royal house of Harrowgate, in the service of King Alaric, and for the 11 years before that I served in places I am not permitted to name, doing work I am not permitted to describe, which is the only reason I am able to tell this story at all. A man who has taken a weapon from another man's hands in the dark, with real consequences waiting on the far side of the mistake, learned something that no parade ground ever teaches, that the taking is the easy part. The not firing is the discipline. The keeping of a crowd of strangers alive around the struggle is the discipline. Anyone can win a fight. Very few men can win one and leave no wound behind. But I am ahead of myself. Let me put you where I was standing. The forecourt of Harrowgate is a broad apron of pale gray cobblestone between the outer gate and the inner colonnade, bounded on the crowd's side by a waist-high rail of gilded iron. On a fine day it fills with visitors, families, students on tour, old men who have come to see the guard, because their fathers brought them once, and it stayed in the blood. They press to the rail with their phones held up, and they wait for the changing, the slow ceremonial handover of the post that happens on the hour, because it is the closest most of them will ever come to the ancient machinery of the crown. They are, almost without exception, good people having a small good day. I have watched perhaps 4 million of them across my years at that rail, and I could not tell you one face from another. That is not contempt. It is the discipline again. The eyes forward, the seeing without looking, the wide soft attention that takes in the whole field and fixes on nothing, until something in the field goes wrong, and then the attention narrows like water finding a crack. That afternoon the field went wrong slowly, which is the way it usually does. The dangerous ones are almost never sudden. Sudden is a man who trips, a child who drops an ice, a pigeon that startles a whole rank of tourists into laughter. Sudden is noise, and noise is almost always harmless. The wrong ones are quiet. They arrive at the edge of the crowd, and they do not behave like the crowd. They do not lift a phone. They do not point things out to a companion. They watch the guard the way a man watches a lock he intends to pick, with a flat, measuring, private attention that has nothing of the visitor's open wonder in it. I noticed him at 9 minutes past 2 at the far left of the rail, near the seam where the gilded iron meets the stone pier of the gate. He was perhaps 30, broad through the shoulders under a gray canvas jacket, hood down, hands out of his pockets, which I marked, because a nervous man keeps his hands hidden and a decided man shows them. His weight was on the balls of his feet. He had drifted 3 times. Each time the crowd shifted, he shifted with it, but always a half step nearer the pier, nearer the point where the rail ends, and there is a gap of perhaps 4 feet of open cobble between the public and my post. Most people never notice that gap. He had noticed it. He had been noticing it, I understood, for some minutes before I noticed him. There is a temptation in the telling of a thing like this to make the guard a mind reader, to say I knew in that moment exactly what he intended. I did not know. What I had was a wrongness, A small, persistent burr against the smoothness of an ordinary crowd, and a rule I have never once broken in 19 years. When the field goes wrong, you do not wait to be certain. Certainty arrives late and armed. You move your readiness forward while your body stays perfectly still, so that if the wrongness resolves into nothing, as it does 99 times in 100, no one has seen you so much as blink, and if it resolves into something, you are already 3 steps ahead of the thing you feared. So I did what looks, from the crowd's side of the rail, like absolutely nothing. I did not turn my head. I did not shift my feet. My chin stayed level, my eyes forward, the rifle at the order on my right side, its butt on the stone by my boot, my white-gloved hand loose on the barrel below the muzzle in the posture 10,000 photographs have made familiar. But inside the stillness I moved everything. I found the man in the wide field of my vision, and I held him at the edge of it without ever pointing my face at him. I felt the weight distribution of my own body and adjusted it a fraction, until I was balanced not for standing but for turning. I ran the geometry of the gap, 4 feet of open cobble, the pier to my left, the low rail, the packed crowd 2 deep behind it, a family with a small one near the front, an elderly couple to the right, a knot of students filming, the drop of the shallow step behind me leading to the colonnade. I built, in perhaps 2 seconds, a map of everyone who could be hurt, and every direction a struggle must not be allowed to travel. And then I waited, still as the stone I was standing on, for the crowd to be right or for the man to be wrong. He was wrong at 11 minutes past 2. The hour was near, and the crowd had thickened with people arriving early for the changing, and the thickening is what he had been waiting for, because a thick crowd is a screen and a distraction, and he must have believed, a guarantee that a man in my position would not dare do anything sudden with so many bodies pressed so close. He was right about the last part and catastrophically wrong about what it meant. He came off the rail at the pier not in a run, but in a fast, decided walk, 3 strides across the open cobble, and his hands, I had been watching his hands for 2 minutes, came up and out, and I understood in the same instant both what he wanted and why the wanting made him, for the length of a breath, the most dangerous man in the kingdom. He wanted the rifle. Not to shoot it. I do not believe then or now that he had the first idea how. A man who understood the weapon would never have reached for it the way he did, with both hands closing high on the barrel and the forestock, leaving the working parts in the sling and the balance point entirely alone. A grip that tells a trained man everything. That says this one has held a broom and a crowbar and perhaps a bat, but never a service rifle in anger. He wanted it the way a small, violent mind always wants the symbol. He wanted to take the thing that could not be taken, to wrench the untouchable object out of the untouchable man's hands in front of 100 phones, and to hold it up, however briefly, as proof that the crown and its discipline and its long, cold authority were a costume that came off if you pulled hard enough. He wanted the video. He wanted the 4 seconds where he owned the rifle. What he did with those 4 seconds, swung it, dropped it, fired it by accident into that packed crowd, into the family at the rail, was not, I think, a thing he had planned at all, which is precisely what made it a thing I could not permit for even one of those 4 seconds to exist. Here is what the crowd saw. They saw a man cross the gap. They saw his hands reach the rifle. And then, before the reaching was finished, they saw the rifle simply not be where his hands were closing, and the man's own momentum carry him forward into an empty grip, and a white-gloved hand take him by the wrist in a way that folded him down and sideways as though the cobblestones had reached up and asked for him, and it was done. Perhaps 2 seconds. No shout, no blow they could name, no shot, above all no shot, and the guard who had not moved in an hour standing again at the order, chest heaving once, the rifle back on his right side, and a man face down and still on the stone at his boots with one arm bent up behind him, and a single white glove pinning it there. That is what they saw, and it is not wrong exactly. It is only missing everything. What actually happened between his reach and his fall is the story, and it happened in a place the phones could not go, which is inside the training. Let me slow it down to the speed it truly ran at, which was the speed of a life's worth of preparation collapsing into 2 seconds of use. The instant his hands committed, the instant I saw the grip close high and wrong on the barrel, the decision was already made because I had made it 2 minutes before, standing still when I built the map. The decision was this: he does not get the weapon, he does not get thrown into the crowd, no shot is fired, and no one behind that rail is touched. 4 conditions, all of which had to be satisfied simultaneously in a struggle over a loaded rifle, 3 feet from a family with a small child, in front of 100 cameras, by a man who was not permitted to strike a member of the public unless there was no other way. That is not a fight. A fight has one condition: win. This was a problem in 4 dimensions that had to be solved in the time it takes to exhale, and the only reason it was solvable at all is that I had solved its like before, in the dark, where getting it wrong meant something worse than embarrassment. The first thing I did was give him the barrel. I know how that sounds, but a weapon grab is not won by strength, and it is never, ever won by pull back against a man who has the barrel and you turn the muzzle into an arc. You make the weapon whip. You invite exactly the discharge you are trying to prevent. So I did not pull. I stepped in. I moved asterisk with his reach, toward him and off the line, so that instead of a rope pull between 2 men, which the stronger or the more desperate man wins, and desperation is stronger than strength, there was suddenly no tension at all, only me inside his reach where his leverage died, my right hand rolling the rifle down and in against my own body where his grip on the forend became useless, the muzzle rotating not toward the crowd, never once toward the crowd, but down and to the left. Into the 4 safe feet of open cobble I had marked out 2 minutes before. That was the map's whole purpose. In the middle of a thing that looks like chaos, I always know exactly where the empty safe ground is, because I found it while I was still standing still. The second thing I did was take his wrist. Not both hands. One man cannot control a struggling opponent and a loaded weapon with both hands at once, and if you try, you lose one to keep the other. I kept the rifle secured against my body with the right, and I took his near wrist with my left, the white glove closing over the joint where his own hand's leverage was weakest, and I turned it. That is all a disarm is at the last. You do not pull the hand, you out-turn the wrist behind it, because a wrist rolled past its natural travel drags the whole arm after it and the whole man after the arm, and the thing he was gripping so hard opens itself, not because you tore it free, but because his hand no longer had a choice. His fingers came off the barrel the way a clenched fist comes open when you bend the wrist back far enough. I have watched grown men, far stronger than he was, let go of knives that way without ever deciding to. And once his hand was off the weapon was mine again, and 3 of my 4 conditions were already met, in something under a second and a half, before most of the crowd had drawn the breath they would let out as a gasp. The 4th condition was the hardest, and it is the one nobody thinks about, and it is the one that separates the man I am from the man who merely wins the fight. The 4th condition was, put him down without hurting him, and without letting the crowd see him hurt, because a member of the public struck bloody on the palace forecourt is its own kind of catastrophe, a different weapon aimed at a different target, and the crown loses whether the thug wins or the guard wins ugly. So I did not throw him. Throwing was available, his momentum was already carrying him, and with the wrist I could have folded him into the pier hard enough to end the day for him. But behind the pier was stone, and stone does to a skull what I am not paid to do to anyone, and beyond that a man thrown is a man out of control, and I do not let anything in that struggle out of my control, not for an instant, not the rifle, not the muzzle, not him. So instead of throwing him, I lowered him. I took the turn I had in his wrist and I fed it downward, into the open cobble, so that his own bent arm became the rail he slid down, and I went down a half step with him to govern the speed of it, and he arrived on the stone not thrown but asterisk placed, face down. the arm I held drawn up behind him into the hold that ends all argument, my knee finding the ground beside him and my weight settling just so, enough that he could not rise, not 1 ounce more than enough. He hit the cobbles the way a man lies down, not the way a man falls. From the crowd it looked like a magic trick. From inside it was arithmetic. And the rifle, through all of it, this is the part I need you to understand, because it is the whole of what I am. The rifle never once pointed at a living soul. Not at him. Not at the crowd. Not at the family at the rail. From the moment his hands closed on the barrel to the moment he lay still, the muzzle traveled down and left and stayed there, describing an arc that began and ended in the only 4 feet of that whole crowded forecourt where a discharge would have struck nothing but stone. I did not think about that during. I could not have. There was no during long enough to think in. I had thought about it before, 2 minutes before, standing still as a statue with my eyes forward, when the only thing anyone could have seen me doing was nothing at all. That is the secret the crowd never learns. The stillness is not the absence of the action. The stillness is asterisk the action. Everything that made those 2 seconds survivable, I did while I appeared to be doing nothing, and the 2 seconds themselves were only the cashing of a check I had written in advance. I want to tell you it felt like triumph. It did not. What it felt like in the first clear moment afterward, the man pinned, the rifle secure, my breath coming hard for the first time in an hour, was a cold and total attention to the crowd. Because a crowd around a thing like this is its own emergency. And the one I had just ended could become 3 worse ones in as many seconds if the people behind the rail decided all at once that they were frightened. They were on the edge of deciding. I could feel it, the way you feel whether coming. 100 people had watched a man rush the guard and go down, and they had not yet been told by anything in the world what it meant, whether they were safe or whether this was the beginning of something. And a crowd left too long in that not knowing does the crowd's oldest and most dangerous thing. It panics, and it moves, and it tramples the small and the old and the slow at the front against the gilded rail. The family with the little one was at the front. So before I did anything else, before I called it in, before I so much as looked down at the man beneath my knee, I lifted my head, and I found the nearest frightened faces, and I gave them the only thing that would hold them, which was the sight of the guard, upright and unhurried and entirely unafraid, exactly as he had been the moment before, as though the impossible thing they had just witnessed were merely a part of the day's routine that they had been fortunate to see. I did not shout asterisk stay calm. Telling a crowd to stay calm is how you tell a crowd it should not be. I did the opposite. I resumed. I settled my weight. I squared my shoulders under the bearskin. I let my face go back to the flat forward stillness it had worn all hour, and I let the man beneath me lie quiet and unbleeding and plainly, visibly handled, and the crowd read all of it in the half-second it takes to read a face, and the weather broke. The fear that had been about to become a stampede became, instead, a gasp, and then a strange rolling murmur, and then this always astonishes me, though I have seen it before, applause. Scattered at first, near the pier where they had seen it closest, then spreading down the rail like a wave. They were clapping, not for the takedown, I think. I have decided in the years since that they were clapping for the thing underneath the takedown, the thing they could feel even if they could not name it, that they had been, for 2 seconds, in real danger, and that a man had stood between them and it and made it look like nothing, and that they were all still whole. People clap when they discover they are safe. It is one of the better things about them. The inner colonnade came alive behind me. I did not turn to look. I did not need to. The palace does not leave a post to face a thing like that alone for longer than it takes boots to cross stone, and the boots were already crossing. My relief sergeant, a broad, steady man named Corwin Pell, was at my shoulder within seconds, and behind him 2 more of the house guard, and I felt rather than saw the practiced fan-out, 1 man to the crowd to steady the rail, 1 to the gate, Pell to me. I heard his voice, low, close to my ear, the question that is really 4 questions folded into 3 words. Vane, you green. Green. It is our word for asterisk whole and functioning. The old signal lamp color, the go-ahead, the all-clear. He was asking whether I was hurt, whether the weapon was accounted for, whether the man was secured, and whether I was still the man he had left on this post an hour ago or someone the last 2 seconds had broken. All of it in one syllable, because that is how men who trust each other speak in the minutes after. "Green," I said. "Weapon secure. Chambers fine, never left my body. He's handled, no marks, keep it that way, we're on 100 cameras. Get the front of that crowd back off the rail before they crush the family." "Done," Pell said, and was gone into the doing of it, and that fast the emergency stopped being mine. I have thought a great deal since about that handover, about how the whole strength of the thing we serve is contained in it. One man cannot hold a post, take a weapon, secure a prisoner, calm a crowd, and see to the safety of 100 strangers all at once for very long. What one man can do is hold the line for the seconds it takes the rest to arrive and trust, without looking, without doubting, without a wasted glance, that they will arrive. I did not turn to check that Pell was coming. I knew he was coming the way I knew my own name. That knowing is not faith. It is 19 years of every man on that wall coming every time without fail, so that the not turning becomes the truest thing you own. The crowd saw one guard. There was never one guard. There were 400 years of men behind me, and every one of them was standing that post with me, and the thug who thought he could pull the crown off like a costume had, without the first idea of it, put his hands not on a man but on all of them at once. He was beginning to understand that now, beneath my knee. I could feel the change in him. The first hot certainty of the rush had drained out and left the cold arithmetic behind, the same arithmetic I had done in advance, arriving in him too late to be of any use. That he was face down on the king's stone with his own arm bent up behind him, and the rifle he had reached for back on the shoulder of the man he had reached for it from, and 100 phones recording the exact shape of his failure, and that whatever he had imagined those 4 seconds of owning the untouchable thing would feel like, this was not it. He had not made a sound since he hit the cobbles. Now he made one, not a threat, not a curse, just a low, broken exhalation, the sound a man makes when the story he told himself about who he was collides with the wall of who he actually turned out to be. I have heard that sound before too. It is, in its way, the beginning of the only good thing that can come out of a man like that. I eased my weight a fraction, not enough to free him, only enough to let him breathe fully, because a secured man is not a punished man, and the difference is the whole of what separates us from the thing we guard against. "Lie still," I told him, and it was the first thing I had said to him, and I kept my voice at the level you would use to tell a stranger the time. "It's over. You're not hurt. Keep it that way." He kept it that way. Whatever else he was not a fool twice in one afternoon. The generic officers of the palace precinct, the civil police who hold the outer ring beyond our own duty, arrived in under 2 minutes, which is fast, and told me they had been moving toward the forecourt already, because a dozen people in the crowd had begun calling it in the instant the man came off the rail, half of them describing an assassination and half of them describing a magic trick, and dispatch had not known which to believe. The senior of them, a weathered sergeant named Halloran, whom I had known by sight for years, crouched by the man on the cobbles and looked, first, not at him but at me, and at the rifle back on my shoulder, and at the utterly unmarked prisoner, and something in his face did a slow, complicated thing that I have come to recognize as the reaction of a professional who has just understood exactly how badly the last 2 minutes could have gone, and exactly how completely they did not. "He get the weapon?" Halloran asked. It was the only question that mattered to him. "His hands were on the barrel for under 2 seconds, I said. "The muzzle never crossed a person. Chambers untouched, safety was never off. Nothing discharged, nothing pointed, no round anywhere it shouldn't be. He never had it. He had a grip on it. Those are different things." Halloran looked at me a moment longer. "You want to tell me how a man that size," he nodded at the prisoner, who was broad and low and plainly powerful, goes from both hands on your rifle to face down on my cobbles in the time it takes me to blink, without a mark on him, and without you appearing to hurry. No, I said, and I meant it kindly. I don't think I could in a way you'd believe. Take him, take my statement whenever you like, and Sergeant, mind the crowd on your way. There's a family at the front left who had a bad 2 minutes. Someone should tell them they're all right. They won't believe it from me. I'm the reason they're not sure. He took him. It was done cleanly. The man drawn up off the stone by 2 officers with his hands secured, still unmarked, walked rather than dragged. And I felt the last knot of the thing loosen in my chest as he passed out of my custody and into the ordinary machinery of the law where he belonged, and where I will tell you now, so you are not left waiting for a violence that never comes. Nothing dramatic happened to him at all. He was charged, and he was tried, and he was found to be exactly what I had read him to be at 9 minutes past 2. A small angry man with a long thin record of small angry things, who had convinced himself in some dim corner that pulling the Crown's rifle out of the Crown's hands on camera would make him, for 4 seconds, larger than his life had allowed him to be, and who had discovered instead that the untouchable thing was untouchable for a reason, and that the reason had a name, and the name was every man who had ever stood that post. He went to prison for a while. It was not a long while. He was not, in the end, an important man, and I have tried never to make him one by telling this story as though the danger had been his greatness rather than his carelessness. The danger was never that he was strong. The danger was that he was reckless with a loaded weapon in a crowd, and recklessness does not require greatness to kill a child. That is the whole reason it could not be permitted to exist for even one of his 4 seconds, not because of who he was, because of who was standing behind that rail. But I have run ahead again. Let me go back to the forecourt, because the true story of that afternoon is not the 2 seconds of the disarm. Those 2 seconds are only the part you can film. The true story is the hour before them, and the days after, and the reason a man like me was standing at that gate at all, the reason a former operator of the kind of work I did in the dark ends his career, if he is lucky, holding a ceremonial rifle at a tourist rail. People assume the rail is a demotion, a soft berth for an old soldier's last years, a costume standing in front of a costume. They could not be more wrong, and the fact of that afternoon is the proof of it. The rail is not where you send a man whose sharpest days are behind him. The rail is the hardest post in the service, because it is the only one where the whole of your training must live permanently inside perfect stillness, where you may not draw, may not warn, may not so much as widen your stance without turning a good day for 4 million people into a frightening one, and where, on the one afternoon in a decade when it matters, the entire library of everything you have ever learned about violence must be opened, used, and closed again in 2 seconds. Without a single wasted motion the public can see, and then folded back into stillness as though it had never left. Any young man with a strong arm can be taught to fight. It takes a lifetime to learn to fight once, cleanly, invisibly, and then simply stand back up as though nothing at all has happened. That is what the rail is for. That is the man it is meant to hold. Corwin Pell came back to me once the crowd was steadied and the prisoner was gone, and the ceremony, mercifully, had been quietly suspended. The visitors gently turned back through the gate by officers with the particular soft firmness that keeps a crowd from becoming a story of its own. He stood beside me at the post, both of us facing forward out of long habit, even with nothing left to guard against. And for a moment neither of us said anything, which is its own kind of conversation between men like us. That, Pell said at last, is going to be everywhere by tonight. I know. Half of them think you're a wizard. The other half are already saying you nearly killed a man. I know that too, I did. It is the price of the rail in the age of the phone. Whatever you do, however clean, will be cut into 100 versions before the sun goes down, and the versions that travel farthest are always the ones that flatten the truth into something that fits in a fist, hero, or brute, or wizard, or thug. The one thing the phone can never film is the hour of stillness that made the 2 seconds safe, and so the one thing that never travels is the truth. "You want to know what I think," Pell said. "You'll tell me either way." "I think," he said, "the ones who are frightened of what you did are frightened of the wrong thing. They think the frightening part is that you could do it. The frightening part is that you didn't do more. Any of us could have put that man through the pier. You put him down like you were tucking him in. There's men on this wall would have made him bleed just to prove they could and been in the right of it, and the Crown would have paid for it for a year." He was quiet a moment. "You made it look like nothing because you made asterisk it nothing. There's no video of the thing you actually did, Vane. There's only a video of you not doing the 10 worst things, and nobody claps for that because nobody can see it." He shook his head. 19 years I've watched you do the invisible work. I still don't know how you teach it." "You don't," I said. "You survive long enough to learn it, or you don't. There's a cost to it that no one sees, and I will name it here because it is part of the truth, and because young men considering this life deserve to know the price before they pay it. The cost is not the 2 seconds. The 2 seconds are almost easy. The training does them for you. The body moves through the grooves a lifetime has worn into it, and you are, in a strange way, most at peace in the middle of them, because at last there is only one thing to do, and you have spent your whole life learning to do it. The cost comes after. It comes that night when the flat is quiet and the uniform is hung and there is no crowd to hold still for, and the body, which held its perfect stillness for an hour and then spent everything in 2 seconds, and then held its stillness again for hours more, finally lets go. My hands shook that night. They always do after. It is the tax the discipline levies in arrears. A man who stays calm through a thing does not skip the fear. He only defers it, borrows against it, and the fear comes to collect when it is safe, alone in the dark, all at once. I sat in my chair with my hands shaking, and I let them, because that too is the discipline. You do not pretend the tax is not owed. You simply arrange to pay it where no one can see, so that the crowd never learns what their safety cost the man who bought it for them. And I thought that night about the little boy at the rail. Not with fear, the fear had already passed him by. He was safe. He would never know. I thought about how close the world runs all the time to the edge of a thing, and how thin the line is that holds it back, and how that line is made of nothing but men who have decided in advance on 100 quiet mornings that when the storm comes they will step toward it and not away. It is not a comfortable thought, but it is the true one, and a man who stands the rail learns to live inside it, and even after enough years to be strangely grateful for it, because to be the line, to be the thing the world's thinness leans against, is a purpose so plain and so large that it makes the shaking hands a small price, and the sleepless night a fair one, and the whole strange invisible life worth the living. I slept, in the end. Men like me always do. The stillness we carry into the world we carry back out of it, and it holds us too in the dark, when there is no one left to hold still for but ourselves. That was the truest thing I could give Pell, and the truest thing I have given you, and it is where I have to take you next, back, further back than the forecourt, to how a man learns to do the invisible work, because the disarm at the rail did not begin at 11 minutes past 2 on a gray afternoon. It began 30 years earlier, in the dark, with a rifle in another man's hands, and a very different set of consequences waiting on the far side of the mistake. And it began, though I could not have known it then, with the single lesson that would one day stand between a reckless stranger and a family at a gilded rail. I did not grow up meaning to be a soldier, still less a guard. I grew up in a gray mill town where the river ran the color of the sky, and the men came home from the works with their hands ruined and their tempers short. And the thing I learned earliest was how to read a room full of tired, angry men for the one who was about to become a problem. Which of them was drifting toward the wrong end of the bar, whose weight had gone onto the balls of his feet, whose hands had come out of his pockets. I did not know I was learning it. It was simply survival, the way a small boy in a hard place learns the weather of the grown men around him, so that he is never in the path of the storm when it breaks. Years later in the service, an instructor would give that survival a name, pre-attack indicators, he called it, and drew them on a board as though they were a discovery. And I sat in the back of that room and understood for the first time that the thing I had done since I was 7 years old to stay whole was a skill men were sent across the world to learn. I had a decade's head start on all of them, and I did not even know it had been a lesson. The service took me because I was quiet and steady and I did not flinch, and it sent me, after a while, to the places where the work is done that no one is told about, the long, patient work of standing between ordinary people and the men who would harm them, in rooms and streets and countries I will not name, under a discipline far harsher than any parade. I will not tell war stories. They are not mine to tell, most of them, and the ones that are mine I have found do more harm than good in the telling, because they make the young men who hear them want the wrong thing. But I will tell you the one that made me, because it is the one that stood at the rail with me 30 years later, and because a man deserves to know where the hands that saved him learned their trade. There was a night, this is all I will say of where, when I was young in the work and certain of my own strength, and a man I was meant to be securing got a hand on my weapon in the dark. He was bigger than I was and he was frightened, which is worse than strong, and my whole body wanted to do the thing every untrained body wants to do, which is to pull back, to win the rope pull, to tear the weapon away by force. I pulled. And in the fraction of a second that I pulled, the muzzle came around in an arc across a doorway, and in that doorway, though I had not known it, there were people, the very people I was there to keep from harm, and the weapon, wrenched between two straining men, came within the breadth of a thought of discharging into them. It did not. Grace or luck or the mercy of a jammed instant, and it did not. But I felt the arc of that muzzle cross those innocent lives, and I have felt it every day since, and it taught me in 1 second of cold horror the lesson that no drill had managed to teach me in a year, that the man who pulls back against a weapon grab has already lost, whatever happens next, because he has made the weapon into a whip and pointed the whip at everyone he was trying to protect. You do not pull. You never pull. You step in, you kill the leverage. You turn the muzzle to the only safe ground in the room, and you win by refusing the fight the other man thinks he is having. I learned that at the cost of a terror I have never fully put down, and I carried it out of the dark and up to a gilded rail in the daylight, and 30 years later a reckless stranger reached for my rifle in front of a family, and my body did not want to pull. My body had been taught at a price to step in. That is the whole of it. That is the invisible work. The crowd saw 2 seconds of a magic trick. What they were really watching was the far end of a 30-year-old night, the exact moment when a young man's worst mistake finally finished, making itself into an old man's flawless discipline. I left the dark work eventually. As men do, you cannot stand in that current forever without it taking something from you that does not grow back, and the wise ones come in from it before it takes too much. I came in. And when the house guard let it be known quietly, through the quiet channels such things move through, that they were looking for men of a certain kind for the certain posts, the ones that look ceremonial and are not, I put my name forward, and I was taken, and I traded the dark for the daylight and the unnamed places for a single gilded rail, and I have never once regretted it. People pity the old operator who ends his days holding a parade rifle in a costume. They have it exactly backward. There is no higher use for everything I learned in the dark than to stand in the bright open daylight in front of 4 million good people having their small good days, and to be the thing that means the storm never reaches them. And, on the one afternoon in a decade when the storm comes anyway, to end it so cleanly, and so quietly that they go home believing they were never truly in its path. The dark work is done in secret, and no one is ever grateful because no one ever knows. The rail is the same work done in the light, and the only difference is that once in a great while they see. That afternoon, for 2 seconds they saw. It is the closest my whole strange career has ever come to being visible, and even then they saw the wrong thing. I want to say more about the training because people imagine it wrongly, And the wrong imagining is part of what let Morwenna's story take root. They picture a man taught to be violent, taught to strike, to break, to end. That is the smallest and least important part of what a man like me is taught, and it is the part any strong young fool can learn in a season. The real training, the years-long training, the training that stood at the rail with me, is the training in restraint. It is the endless, grinding, unglamorous discipline of learning to to not react, to not strike, to not fire, to not pull, to hold every violent capability you possess in a closed hand and open it only exactly as far as a specific situation requires, and not one finger further. A trained man is not a dangerous man made more dangerous. A trained man is a dangerous man taught to be safe, taught, at enormous cost and over enormous time, to carry great force with such precision that it harms nothing it is not aimed at. The untrained strong man is the danger. He swings the whole hand. The trained man opens one finger. That is the entire difference, and the whole kingdom nearly missed it because a whole kingdom has never had to learn it, and thank God for that, because the fact that they have never had to learn it is precisely the thing men like me exist to preserve. I had an instructor in my early years, a hard, spare old soldier named Master Sergeant Odell, who taught the thing better than anyone I have known, and he taught it with an empty hand and a great deal of patience, and one lesson he made us do until we hated it. He would have us stand unarmed in the center of a circle, and he would send man after man at us with a training weapon, a rubber knife, a padded baton, an unloaded rifle to grab, and our task was not to win. Any of us could win. We were young and strong and fast. Our task was to end each encounter with the attacker unharmed and the weapon controlled, and above all, with the instructor's chalked outline of a bystander, a rough child-sized shape drawn on the floor at the circle's edge, never once crossed by the line of the weapon. He drew it small on purpose. He put it low and close, at the edge, where you would forget it in the heat of the thing. And a man who won the fight but let the weapon's line cross that chalk outline failed the drill entirely, no matter how cleanly he had disarmed his man, and did it again, and again, until the awareness of the small shape at the edge of the circle became as automatic as breathing, until you could not, physically could not, move a weapon through the space where the vulnerable stood, because your body had been trained past the possibility of it. The fight is easy, Odell used to say in his flat, dry voice, walking the circle with his hands behind his back. The fight is for children. Any dog can win a fight. What I am teaching you is the far harder thing, which is to win a fight in a room full of people who must not be touched, and to walk out of it having touched none of them, including the man you fought. If you cannot do that, you are not a soldier. You are just a strong animal with a weapon, and I have no use for you, and neither does anyone worth serving. I hated that drill. I hated it for a year. And then, one gray morning at a gilded rail 30 years later, a reckless stranger grabbed my rifle 3 feet from a family with a small boy at the mother's hip, and I did not have to think about the boy, because Odell's chalk outline had been drawn into me so deeply that my body found the safe ground before my mind knew there was a decision to make. The boy at the rail was the chalk shape at the edge of the circle. I had been protecting him, in drill after hated drill, for 30 years before he was born. That is the training. That is what they nearly convinced a kingdom to be afraid of. Not a man taught to harm, a man taught, at a price most people would never willingly pay, to be the one person in a violent moment who can be absolutely trusted to harm no one who does not need harming, and to protect, without a wasted motion, everyone who does. Odell is long dead now. He never knew about the forecourt. He was gone years before it. But I thought of him that gray afternoon in the clear, cold moment after the man was down and the crowd was steadying, and I thought, the chalk held. 30 years and the chalk held. If there is an afterlife and he is anywhere in it, I hope he knows. It was the finest work I ever did, and it was his, as much as mine, passed hand to hand down the long line of men who have taught other men to carry force without becoming it, which is the oldest and least celebrated craft in the whole trade of arms, and the only one that matters when the moment finally comes. There is one more thing about those early years that belongs here, because it explains something about the 4 days of silence that came later, and about why I could bear them. Somewhere in my training I stopped needing to be seen. I do not know exactly when it happened. It is not a thing that happens on a particular day. But the dark work does it to you, slowly, if it does not break you first. It teaches you to do the most important things you will ever do in a place where no one will ever know you did them, for people who will never learn your name, and to find that this is enough, that the doing itself is the reward, and the being thanked is a thing you learn to live without, and eventually a thing you stop even wanting. A man who still needs to be seen cannot stand the rail, because the rail's whole nature is invisibility. You keep 4 million people safe by being a statue they walk past without a glance, and the day you need one of them to notice is the day you have started to fail. I had lost the need to be seen long before I came to the daylight. That is why, when Morwenna's lie painted me a villain, and my discipline gave me no way to answer it, I could stand in the silence without it destroying me. I had spent 30 years doing good that no one would ever see or thank. 4 days of being seen wrongly was a small thing next to that. The men who cannot bear to be misunderstood are the men who still, somewhere, need to be understood. I had let that go a long time ago in the dark, and the letting go, which had cost me something once, turned out in the 4 days to be the very armor that saved me. Now let me bring you forward again, past the forecourt, into the days that followed, because a thing like that does not end when the prisoner is taken and the crowd goes home. It goes out into the world and it takes on a life, and the life it takes on becomes its own kind of test. A longer, slower, more insidious test than the 2 seconds at the rail, and one I very nearly failed. By that evening it was, as Pell had promised, everywhere. The footage, a dozen versions of it from a dozen phones at a dozen angles, ran on every screen in the kingdom and a good many beyond it. And Pell had been right about the shape of the thing, too. It split cleanly down the middle, into 2 stories that could not both be true and yet were told with equal certainty by equal numbers of people. In the first story I was a hero, the stone-still guard who had foiled an attack on the crown with a flawless disarm, and not a drop of blood spilled, the very image of the discipline the whole institution exists to embody. In the second story I was a danger, a trained killer in a tourist attraction, a man who had used frightening violence on a member of the public in front of children, whatever he had reached for, and the fact that no one was hurt was held up not as the proof of my restraint, but as the proof that the whole thing had been an overreaction to a foolish stunt. The second story had a champion, and the champion was not slow to make herself heard, and her name was Queen Consort Morwenna. I did not at first understand why the king's second wife should take an interest in a gate guard and a thug. I understand it now, and the understanding is not flattering to her, but it is the truth, and this story cannot be told honestly without it. Morwenna had come to the house of Harrowgate as King Alaric's second queen after the death of the late Queen Isolde, and she had spent the years since in a patient, quiet campaign to make the palace hers, to move her own people into its rooms and its offices and its long lines of authority, and to move out, one by one, the old servants of the house whose loyalty ran to the king and the crown prince and the memory of the first queen rather than to her. She had a particular dislike. It was well known below stairs for the house guard because we were the one part of the palace she had never been able to make hers. We do not answer to the consort. We never have. Our post and our oath run to the crown itself, and to the king who wears it, and to the heir who will, and no queen consort in 400 years has ever held the guard's leash, and Morwenna wanted the leash the way she wanted everything, not for its use, but because it was the one thing she had been told she could not have. And here into her lap fell a gift, a house guardsman filmed in an act half the kingdom was calling excessive. If she could make that story stick, if she could turn the afternoon at the rail from a rescue into a scandal, from discipline into brutality. She could do the thing she had wanted to do for years and had never had a lever for. She could put the guard on trial in public, and through the guard put the guard's asterisk independence on trial, and argue, in the reasonable, concerned, protective voice she used for all her worst work, that a body of armed men who answered to no one but themselves and could put a citizen on the cobblestones in front of children was a danger that ought to answer to someone, to a review board, to an oversight office, to a hand on the leash. And whose hand would that be? She had a candidate ready. She always did. I learned all of this not at once, but in pieces, over the days that followed, the way you learn the shape of a thing that is being built to fall on you. The first piece came the very next morning, when I was summoned, not to the king, which would have been ordinary, but to the office of the palace's newly appointed controller of the household, a smooth gray man named Lord Fenwick, whom everyone below stairs knew to be Morwenna's creature, moved into the post 6 months earlier over the objection of half the court. He received me with great courtesy and greater sorrow, and he told me, in the voice of a man delivering condolences, that a formal review had been opened into the forecourt incident, that I was suspended from my post pending its outcome, that I was of course presumed to have acted in good faith, and that it would be best for everyone, for the guard, for the crown, for my own good name, if the matter were handled quietly, and I did not speak to anyone about it, least of all the press. He was very sorry. He hoped I understood. He was certain it would all come right. I understood perfectly, which is a thing men like Fenwick never expect of men like me. They see the uniform and the silence, and they assume the silence is emptiness, that a man who does not speak has nothing behind the not speaking. It is the same mistake the thug made at the rail. Fenwick thought he was suspending a costume. He was, in fact, opening a door he did not understand the far side of, because the moment the house guard is put on trial, quietly, through the consort's creature, over the head of the king finds out, and the crown prince finds out, and 400 years of an institution that has never once let one of its own be broken by a palace faction finds out, and none of them are costumes either. But that was days away. On that first morning I did the only thing my whole life had taught me to do when the storm comes. I said nothing. I did nothing. I gave Fenwick not one word he could carry back, and I went home to wait, because the deepest discipline of all, deeper than the disarm, is knowing that the loudest thing you can do in the face of a lie is to stand perfectly still and let the truth arrive on its own feet. It always does. But it needs time and a still place to arrive in, and the willingness of the wronged man to hold his ground and not go looking for it. I had spent 19 years learning to hold a gilded rail against a crowd. I could hold my own front room against a lie for as long as it took. It took 4 days, and they were the longest 4 days of my career, longer than any I ever stood at the rail, because at the rail the enemy at least has the decency to show himself. This one worked in the dark, the way Morwenna always worked, and for 4 days I watched the story of the forecourt curdle in the public air. The versions that had merely been split now began to take sides, and the side that painted me as a danger found, suddenly, a great deal of new fuel. An unnamed palace source, quoted expressing grave concern over the militarization of the ceremonial guard. A commentator, apparently out of nowhere, asking with grave sincerity whether it was right that men trained for war should stand among families and children with live weapons and the license to use them. A slow, patient drip of doubt, each drop reasonable on its own, that added together to a single insistent question. Is the guard safe? I recognize the technique. It is the oldest one there is. You do not accuse a man of a crime you cannot prove. You simply ask, again and again in a concerned voice, whether he might be dangerous, until the asking becomes the answer. And the cruelest part of it, the part that Morwenna understood and used, was that I could not defend myself without making it worse. If I spoke, I was a guard breaking his silence to argue with the public, which only proved I was not the disciplined figure the institution claimed. If I released my side, I looked like a man managing his image, which only fed the story that the guard was a political actor rather than a servant. The whole strength of what I am is the silence, and the silence was being used against me, and there was nothing I could do about it but keep it and trust. Again, always, the same trust that let me not turn to check for Pell at the rail, that the institution behind me was moving even though I could not see it move. Corwin Pell came to my flat on the second evening. It was against the spirit of the suspension, if not its letter, and he came anyway in plain clothes, a bottle under his arm, and he sat in my small front room and told me what the wall was saying, because a man cut off from his post needs to know his brothers have not cut him off, and Pell understood that better than the controller ever could. "The wall's with you," he said, "every man on it. There's talk of a statement, a joint one all of us signed, saying what you did and daring them to call it wrong." He watched me over the rim of his glass. "The sergeant major put a stop to it, said the guard doesn't defend itself in the newspapers. The guard is defended by the crown or it isn't the guard. Half the wall thinks he's right. The other half thinks the old man's about to let them break you to save a rule." He set the glass down. "Which is it, Vane? Because I'll tell you honestly, there's a night or two I've thought the second. I had thought it too, I will not pretend otherwise. On the second night, alone, with the screen saying what they said and my post standing empty behind a controller's notice, the temptation to break the silence was a living thing in that room with me. I could have done it. I could have released the full footage myself, given the interview, told the truth in my own voice, and I believe it would have worked. The tide would have turned faster, my name would have been cleared sooner, and I would have spared myself 2 more days of being called a danger to the very people I had bled to protect. Every reasonable instinct said do it, and that precisely was how I knew not to. "It's the rule," I told Pell. "It has to be the rule, listen to me. The day a guardsman defends himself in public against the crown's own household is the day the guard becomes a party to the court's quarrels. One more faction among the factions, with its own voice and its own grievances and its own case to plead. And a guard that pleads its own case is a guard that can be argued with, bargained with, leashed. The whole reason we are safe to stand armed among 4 million strangers is that we have no case of our own. We are the crown's purely, silently, and we do not speak for ourselves because we have nothing of our own to say. The moment I speak to save myself, I prove Morwenna's whole point, that the guard is a power with interests, and interests need oversight. My silence is not weakness, Corwin. My silence is the argument. It is the only argument that answers her, and it only works if I am willing to be destroyed by it rather than break it. So no statement, not from the wall, not from me. We hold. We let the crown defend the crown's guard, or we find out the guard was never worth defending, but we do not become the thing we guard against in order to save one man, not even if the one man is me." Pell was quiet a long time, then he picked his glass back up. "The sergeant major said almost exactly that, word for word nearly." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't believe him. I thought it was the old man protecting the institution over the man. I see it now. It's the same thing the boy grabbed the rifle to test, isn't it? Whether the untouchable thing comes off if you pull hard enough. And the answer's the same. You don't pull back. You hold and you let them break their own grip on nothing." He raised the glass an inch. "To the chalk holding," he said, though he did not know about the chalk, could not have. It only came out of him, the right words by the wrong road, the way true things sometimes do. I drank to it. It was the best moment of those 4 days. The thug's first hearing was on the 3rd day, and I was not required to attend, and did not, but I heard how it went, and it is worth the telling because it closed a thing. He came before the magistrate small and diminished, none of the swagger the rush across the cobbles had promised, and when the footage was played, the real footage, all of it, the safe arc, the clean disarm, the moment I eased my weight and told him he was not hurt, something happened in that courtroom that no one had scripted. The magistrate, an old dry woman with no patience for theater, watched it twice, and then she looked at the man in the dock, and she said, in a voice they said carried to the back of the room, "You reached for that rifle to prove the Crown's discipline was a costume. Watch it again. That is not a costume. That is the only reason you are standing in my court alive and unmarked instead of lying in a morgue, which is where 100 worse men than that guard would have put you, and been within their rights. You owe that man your life and your teeth both. I suggest you spend your sentence thinking about the difference between a man who could have hurt you and chose not to, and yourself." And the thug, this is the part that closed it for me, put his face in his hands and wept, and it was not the weeping of a man who has been caught. It was the weeping of a man who has just understood, for the first time in a life of small violences, that he had been in the presence of a strength he did not know existed, a strength that wins by refusing to wound, and that he had mistaken it for weakness because his whole life had never shown him the other kind. I have thought about that many times. I did not save only the family at the rail that day. I think, without meaning to, I may have shown one lost and violent man the single thing that could ever have turned him, the sight of overwhelming force choosing, deliberately, to be gentle. Whether it took, I never learned. But he wept, and the magistrate saw the truth, and on the third day in a small courtroom I was not even in, the tide had already begun to turn. I simply could not see it yet, standing in my silent flat, keeping the hardest faith I have ever kept. It was. On the fourth day I was summoned again, and this time it was not to Fenwick, it was to the king. King Alaric received me in the small audience room he keeps for the business he means to be private, a plain paneled chamber with a single window looking onto the inner garden, and he was not alone. Beside him stood the Crown Prince Rowan, his son and heir, a serious young man of 30 whose loyalty to the house guard was well known and well earned, and in a chair by the window, upright and sharp-eyed and utterly still in a way I recognized, because it was my own stillness worn by a different kind of person, sat the king's sister, the Princess Adela. She was the one I had not expected, and her presence told me more about the seriousness of the hour than anything the king could have said. Princess Adela does not attend small meetings. She is the sharpest legal and constitutional mind in the house of Harrowgate, the keeper of the old law and the old precedent, the one the king sends for when a thing must not merely be decided, but be decided correctly in a way that will hold when it is challenged, as this would surely be challenged. If Adela was in the room, the king did not intend to settle the forecourt quietly. He intended to settle it permanently. "Guardsman Vane," the king said. He did not sit, and so none of us sat. "I have watched the footage. All of it, not the cuts that are being passed about, but every angle my people could gather, run slow, more times than I care to count. I have had it examined by men who understand these things. And I am told," here he glanced at Rowan, who inclined his head, "that in the 2 seconds it took you to disarm that man, the muzzle of your rifle did not once cross a living person, that you controlled it into the only empty ground on that forecourt, that you took him down without a mark. And that you did all of this, my son's people tell me, not by luck, but by a series of choices so fast and so precise that they could only have been made before the man ever moved, that you were, in effect, ready for a thing you could not have known was coming, and that the readiness is the reason 100 of my subjects went home to their suppers instead of to a hospital or a grave." He paused. "Is that a fair account of what you did?" "It is the fairest anyone has given, your majesty," I said. "Though it credits me with more calm than I felt, I was afraid. I have only learned to be afraid quietly." Something moved in the king's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of respect that a hard man gives to an honest answer. "Then tell me this, Vane. There is a story abroad in my kingdom that you are a danger to my people, that the guard is a danger, that men of your training have no business standing among families with live weapons. I am told this story is gathering weight. I am told," and here his voice cooled by a degree, and I understood that we had reached the true business of the room, that a review has been opened into your conduct in the office of my household's controller without my knowledge and over my head, and that its purpose, if I read it rightly, is less to judge you than to judge the guard itself, to argue that the king's own guard should answer to some new hand of oversight. I would hear your account of that as well. So he knew. Of course he knew. The trust had held, the institution had moved, the king had found out exactly as I had known he would. I chose my words with the care I would have given to the muzzle of a rifle in a crowd. Your Majesty, I am a guardsman. It is not my place to judge the intentions of the consort's household, and I will not. I will tell you only what I know of my own oath. My post runs to the crown, and to the king who wears it, and to the heir who will. It has run there for 400 years. No consort has ever held it, and the reason is not pride. It is that a guard who could be turned by a faction of the court is not a guard at all, but a weapon in the hand of whoever holds the leash, and a weapon in the hand of a faction is the very thing the guard exists to stand against. If the story abroad is that men like me are dangerous because we answer to no faction, then I would say, with respect, that answering to no faction is the whole of what makes us safe. The thug at the rail wanted my rifle. He did not get it. There are those who want the guard's leash. I would ask that they be given it no more easily. The room was quiet. Then Princess Adela spoke for the first time, from her chair by the window, and her voice was dry and precise, and carried the weight of the old law behind it. "He is right, Alaric," she said. "On the point of law he is entirely right, and it is worse than he says because he is too disciplined to say it. The review Fenwick has opened is not merely irregular, it is unconstitutional. The controller of the household has no authority whatsoever over the conduct of the king's guard on the king's own ground. That authority has rested with the crown alone since the charter of the guard, and it has never once been delegated, for precisely the reasons this guardsman has just given you better than any advocate could. Someone has persuaded Fenwick, or Fenwick has been instructed by someone he serves more truly than he serves you, to reach for a power that is not his, in the hope that in the confusion of a public scandal, no one would notice the reach until it had become a habit, and a habit given a year becomes a precedent, and a precedent given 10 becomes the leash. She let that settle. It is the forecourt again, brother. Someone has put their hands on a thing that cannot be taken, and gambled that no one would stop them in time. The only question before you is whether you will be the guard, or whether you will let them keep their grip. I have thought many times since about the elegance of what Adela did in that moment, how she took the 2 seconds at the rail and made them into a mirror the king could see the whole conspiracy in. The disarm and the review were the same act, a reckless grab at an untouchable thing, and the answer to both was the same. You do not pull, you do not shout, you do not fight the fight the other party thinks they are having. You step in, you kill the leverage, and you turn the whole thing quietly and precisely to the only safe ground, which in the king's case was the law itself, the old charter, the 400-year precedent that no amount of curdled public feeling could bend. Morwenna had built her whole gambit on the noise of the scandal. Adela proposed to answer it with the one thing noise cannot touch, a plain, cold, correct point of law, delivered without heat, that made the whole loud edifice fall in a single quiet sentence. The king looked at his sister for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Then he did a thing that I have never seen a king do, and that I will carry to my grave. "Guardsman Vane," King Alaric said, "I owe you an apology. Not for the review, that was not my doing, and it will be undone within the hour. I owe you an apology for the 4 days you have stood suspended under a lie, in silence, because your discipline gave you no other way to answer it, while men who have never risked a single afternoon of their soft lives painted you a danger to the people you would have died to protect. You held your post through those 4 days as surely as you held it at the rail. I saw that you would. I let it run 4 days longer than I should have, because I needed the reach to be plain enough that undoing it would settle the matter for a generation, and I am sorry that your good name was the ground I chose to let them overreach on. It will be made right, publicly. Today. And then the king of Harrowgate in his own small private audience room inclined his head to a gate guard. It was not a bow. Kings do not bow. But it was the king's version of the thing, the small grave lowering of the head that a king gives to perhaps 3 men in his reign, and I felt it land somewhere very deep in the place where the 30-year-old knight still lived, and I understood that the whole long, strange arc of my life, the gray mill town, the dark work, the terror of the muzzle across the doorway, the gilded rail, the 2 seconds, the 4 days of silence had bent, without my ever intending it, toward this. A king lowering his head to the invisible work, and calling it by its true name at last. The crown Prince Rowan stayed behind when the king and Princess Adela had gone, and he walked me out himself, which no heir to the throne need ever do for a gate guard, and in the long paneled corridor he said a thing that told me more about the young man who would one day be my king than any ceremony could have. I studied your 2 seconds, he said, the way my aunt studies a charter, frame by frame. Do you know what I kept coming back to? He did not wait for me to answer. Not the disarm, the step. The half step you took asterisk toward the man when everything in a body says step back. That is the whole thing, isn't it? Everyone watching thinks the courage was in the fight. The courage was in the direction. You stepped into the muzzle of your own weapon so that no one behind you would be in front of it. He was quiet a moment. My father's guard has protected this house for 400 years, Vane, and until I watched that half step, I am not certain I understood what we were being protected from or by whom. I do now. Whatever comes of this, whoever is behind it, you have my word. They will not have the guard, not while I am the man who inherits it. I have held to that word in the years since, and he has kept it, and it began in a corridor with a young prince who had learned to see the invisible work 1 frame at a time. But I tell it here because it mattered to what came next, because the storm, far from ending in the paneled room, was about to reach for the one lever it had left, and the crown prince's word would be the thing that broke that reach. For the faction did not fold when Fenwick's review was closed. A thing built patiently over years does not fold because a king says a hard word in a private room. It changes shape and reaches for higher ground. Within 2 days, a new voice entered the noise, graver, better dressed, harder to answer than the anonymous palace sources. A retired officer of some standing, a man with medals of his own and a reputation for plain speaking, appeared to give his considered professional judgment that what I had done at the rail, however it had ended, was a soldier's reflex loosed in a civilian crowd, and that the real scandal was not one guard but a whole institution that trained men for the dark and then stood them, armed, among families, trusting to their discipline where it ought to have trusted to rules. He did not sound like a faction. He sounded like a wise and worried professional. That was what made him dangerous. He was the review reborn as an argument, and the argument was aimed exactly where Adela had said it would be aimed. At the guard's independence, at the leash, at the 400-year rule that no hand outside the crown may govern the king's own guard. And I could feel in those 2 days the thing beginning to work. Reasonable people who had dismissed the palace sources began to nod at the retired officer. He would know, they said. He is one of them, and even he says there ought to be rules. The mood shifted a degree, and then another, and I understood with a cold clarity that the faction had found, at last, the one attack the king's private word could not parry, because you cannot answer a reasonable-sounding argument about public safety with a decree. A decree only proves the argument's point, that the guard answers to no one, that even a king cannot be questioned about his armed men. Morwenna, or whoever moved the pieces for her, had learned from the failure of the review and come back cleverer. She had stopped attacking the guard and started attacking the asterisk rule asterisk, dressed as concern, voiced by a man no one could easily dismiss. I said nothing still. It was all I could do, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than the rail, harder than the 4 days of silence, because now the silence felt less like discipline, and more like watching a slow tide come up around the thing I had given my life to, unable to lift a hand. I stood my empty flat and I held my peace and I trusted the institution to move, and I confess to you that on the second night of it, my trust was worn thin as old cloth. I did not see how it could be answered. An argument that sounds like wisdom, carried by a man who sounds like a friend, is the hardest thing in the world to disarm. And I, who had disarmed a rifle at 3 feet from a child, could see no way to disarm this. The way, when it came, was not mine. That is the lesson I keep relearning. The guard holds the line for the seconds it takes the rest to arrive, and then he trusts them to arrive. Rowan arrived. The Crown Prince did the one thing the faction had not armored itself against. He did not answer the argument in the newspapers, where it lived and thrived, but summoned the retired officer to the palace, privately, courteously, and asked him 3 quiet questions. Whether he had seen every angle of the footage, or only the cuts. Whether he knew that the muzzle had not once crossed a person. And whether, knowing that, he still believed a rule that had produced that asterisk outcome. A violent man disarmed at arm's length from a child, in 2 seconds, with no shot and no blood and no mark, was a rule that wanted mending. The officer, to his credit, was an honest man who had been shown only the lie. When he was shown the truth, the full footage, the safe arc, Marin Cole's low-angle ground, he did the thing honest men do. He went back to the same newspapers that had carried his warning, and he unsaid it plainly in his own name, and said that he had spoken before he had seen, and that having seen, he judged the guard's discipline the finest he had witnessed in 40 years of service, and that the rule that made such a man possible was a rule to be defended and not mended. One honest man, shown the truth, undid in a day what the faction had spent 2 days building, because a lie needs an army and the truth needs only a single witness willing to say it out loud. That was the false dawn's turning, the setback overcome though the deepest turn, the one that reached the whole frightened public and not merely the officer corps was still to come, and it would come, as I have told you, from a woman I had never met. I would like to tell you the storm ended there, in that paneled room, with the king's word. It did not. A king's word undoes a review. It does not undo a lie that has already gone out into the world and made itself at home in the minds of frightened people. The review was closed within the hour. Exactly as the king had promised, Fenwick's office issued a terse notice that the forecourt matter was resolved and required no further inquiry. And the smooth gray man himself, I heard, was gone from the palace within the month, quietly, the way such creatures always go once the hand that moved them is exposed. But the second story, the Is the Guard Safe asterisk story, did not close with a notice. It had teeth now, and champions, and a life of its own, and for a few more days it looked. This was the false dawn turned inside out, the moment when it seems lost rather than won, as though the truth of the forecourt might drown in the noise regardless of what the king had done in private. Because here was the thing I had not reckoned with, standing at my rail with my whole faith in the arriving of truth. Truth does not, in fact, arrive on its own feet. It arrives only if someone carries it, and the 2 seconds at the rail had left me no way to carry it myself, because the only honest account of what I had done was an account of the 10 worst things I had not done, and you cannot film an absence. There was no video of my restraint. There was only video of a large man going down fast, which a frightened mind reads as violence no matter how gentle the truth beneath it. I had won the 2 seconds so cleanly that I had made myself impossible to defend. The very perfection of the disarm was being used as the proof of my danger. And I understood in those days the deepest bitterness of the invisible work, that its highest achievement is a thing no one can see, and that a man who does the hardest possible good flawlessly may find that flawlessness itself is the rope they hang him with. The truth arrived, in the end, on the feet of the one person I had never thought to count on, because I had not even learned her name. Her name was Marin Cole, and she was the mother in the family at the front left of the rail, the young family I had marked in my map 2 minutes before the thug ever moved, The small child I had built the whole safe geometry of the disarm around without ever once looking at them directly. She had been 3 feet from the muzzle's safe arc. Her little boy had been at her hip. And when the story turned against me, when the concerned voices asked whether the guard was a danger to families with children, it was Marin Cole, a woman I had never spoken to, whose face I could not have picked from the 4 million, who stood up in the middle of it and refused to let the lie stand over the truth of her own child's life. She had filmed it. Of course she had. They all film everything now. But she had not filmed what the others filmed. From where she stood, low and close at the front left, her phone had caught not the takedown but the ground, the very 4 feet of empty cobblestone I had turned the muzzle into, the safe arc itself, made visible. And more than that, she had kept filming afterward, and her phone had caught the thing no other phone had thought worth keeping me in the seconds after, easing my weight off the man so he could breathe, telling him, "You're not hurt, keep it that way," lifting my head to steady the crowd, the whole of the invisible work made briefly, accidentally visible from the one angle low enough and close enough to see it. She gave the footage to no broadcaster. She did a braver thing. She wrote it out in her own plain words, and she put her own name and her own face to it, and she said, in effect, to the whole kingdom, "I was 3 feet from that rifle. My son was at my hip. I have watched every version of this you have been shown, and not one of them is what happened. What happened is that a man saw the danger before it came and put himself and his weapon between it and my child, and ended it so carefully that my boy did not even cry, and then told the man who tried to hurt us that he was not hurt. You are being told to be afraid of the one person on that forecourt who made certain we were safe. I will not be told to be afraid of him. I was there. You were not." That was the turn. Not the king's word in the private room, though that undid the review. Not Adela's cold point of law, though that saved the guard. The thing that turned the public storm, the thing that carried the truth out into the world at last on its own 2 feet, was a mother who had been 3 feet from the muzzle and knew, in the marrow of her, exactly what she had been saved from, and who refused, when it counted, to be frightened of her own rescue. Truth needs a still place to arrive in. It also needs a witness willing to carry it. I had provided the first, standing silent through 4 days of lies. Marin Cole provided the second. And between the two of us, the guard who would not speak in his own defense and the mother who would not be silent in his, the story finally straightened, and the kingdom saw, more or less, what had actually happened at the rail. Not a trained killer overreacting to a fool, but a disciplined man doing the hardest good there is, and making it look like nothing, and being nearly destroyed by the very fact that it looked like nothing. I met her later. It was the only thing I asked for in the whole affair, not a medal, not a commendation, not the public apology the palace pressed on me, though I accepted that too because to refuse it would have been its own kind of vanity. I asked to be allowed to thank the woman who had carried the truth when I could not. They arranged it in the inner garden, away from cameras, and she came with her husband and at her hip, the small boy who had been 3 feet from the muzzle, and who now, having no idea in the world that he had ever been in the least danger, was chiefly interested in the fish in the garden pond. I did not know what to say to her. I am not good at the parts of my work that involve speaking, so I said the plain true thing. "I built the whole of it around you," I told her. "The safe ground, the direction I turned the weapon, everything I did in those 2 seconds I decided in the 2 minutes before, and the deciding was mostly you, where you were standing, and the little one, and the drop of the step behind you. You never knew you were the center of it, but you were. And then you did the thing I couldn't do for myself, so I came to say, I don't have a word large enough for it. Thank you is what I have." She looked at me for a long moment, this ordinary brave woman, and her eyes filled, and she said something I have never forgotten. "You looked like you weren't even watching us," she said. "The whole time we were at that rail before any of it, you looked at nothing. You looked like a statue that didn't know we were there." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, half laughing at herself. "And then it turned out you'd seen everything. You'd seen my boy. You'd worked out where he was. The one man in that whole crowd who looked like he didn't see us was the only one who really did. She shook her head. How do you carry that? Seeing everything, all the time, and standing so still that everyone thinks you see nothing. And there it was, the whole of my life, handed back to me in a question by a woman who had understood it more completely in one afternoon than most of the men I had served with in 30 years. Seeing everything and standing so still that everyone thinks you see nothing. That is the rail. That is the invisible work. That is what the stillness is asterisk for asterisk. Not the absence of attention but the perfection of it. The wide, soft, total awareness held inside a body that has learned to give nothing away, so that the danger never knows it has been seen until it is already too late, and the innocent never know they were watched over at all. You carry it, I said, because someone has to. And because once in a great while, someone like you sees the truth of it, and then it's not so heavy for a while. Her boy chose that moment to announce with great urgency that there were 3 fish and one of them was the biggest, and the gravity of the garden broke, and we were only people again, standing by a pond in the sun, which is the best thing in the world to be and the whole reason men like me stand our post so that others can. I have never seen her since. I have never needed to. She carried the truth when it counted, and I carried the safe ground when it counted, and between us a child watched fish in a garden instead of the thing that so nearly happened at a gilded rail. And if my whole life amounts to only that, I will count it well spent. There is a coda to all of this, and it is the part the king made public, and I will tell it plainly because false modesty is only vanity turned inside out, and because it is the part that settled the matter for a generation, exactly as the king had meant it to. A week after the forecourt, on a bright still morning with a great crowd gathered, a larger crowd than the rail had ever held, drawn by the story that had swept the kingdom, King Alaric came down himself to the forecourt of Harrowgate, with the crown Prince Rowan at his shoulder and the Princess Adela at his other side, and he stood at the very spot where the thug had crossed the gap, and he spoke to his people. He did not speak long. Kings who mean a thing rarely do. He said that a lie had been told about the guard, and that he had come in person to unsay it, because some lies are too important to be corrected by a notice from an office. He said that on that spot, a week before, a man had reached for a rifle in the hands of one of his guards, in the middle of a crowd of families, and that a great many people had been told to be frightened of what the guard did next. And he said that he had looked, with his own eyes, at every angle of what the guard had done, and that he wished his people to understand exactly what they had been asked to fear. You were asked to fear a man, the king said, who saw the danger before it arrived, who moved his weapon, in the 2 seconds he was given, into the only ground on this whole forecourt where a discharge would have struck no one, who took a violent man down without leaving a mark on him, in front of your children, and then knelt and told that same man he was not hurt. You were asked to fear the one person on this ground who made certain that every one of you went home. You were asked to fear his discipline. I will tell you what his discipline is. And here the king's voice did a thing I had not expected and dropped, so that the whole vast crowd leaned in to catch it. His discipline is the reason you are alive to be told to fear it. A man who wished to harm you would not need discipline. It is the man who wishes to protect you, in a crowd with a weapon, without harming a soul, who needs discipline beyond anything the rest of us will ever be asked for. You have been standing in front of that discipline for years and calling it a statue. It is not a statue. It is the most awake man on this forecourt, and it has been watching over you the whole time, and the only reason you never knew is that watching over you quietly is the entire nature of the gift. Then the king did the second thing, the thing that made the newspapers and the screens and the long memory of the kingdom. He turned to me where I stood again at my post, restored in the exact spot I had held for 19 years, and he pinned to my tunic the small plain decoration that the House of Harrowgate gives, very rarely, for an act of conspicuous discipline in the protection of the public. Not the great medals of war, which are for taking life bravely, but the quieter honor, the one almost no one has heard of, that is given for the far harder thing. For not taking it, when taking it would have been easy and forgiven, and for protecting the innocent at the cost of every simpler choice. It is the only decoration I have ever wanted, and I had never expected to be given it, because it is given for the invisible work, and the invisible work is by its nature unseen. That day, for once, it was seen. The crowd did the thing crowds do when they discover they are safe, and have been safe all along, and have only just been told so by someone they believe. They were quiet for a moment, the whole great mass of them taking it in, and then they were not quiet at all. I stood at the order through the whole of it, eyes forward, chin level, the rifle on my right side and its butt on the stone by my boot, exactly as I have stood for 19 years, and I let the sound of it wash over me without moving a muscle of my face, because that is the discipline too, and the discipline does not take days off for its own honoring. But I will tell you that inside the stillness, where no camera has ever gone and no crowd has ever seen, something in me that had been clenched since a 30-year-old night in the dark, since the terror of a muzzle crossing a doorway full of the innocent, came quietly and finally to rest. I had carried that night for 3 decades. I had turned it into the thing that saved a family at a rail. And now a king had stood on the spot and named it, and a mother had carried its truth, and a child was watching fish in a garden somewhere across the city, and the long arc of a life spent doing the good that cannot be seen had bent, for one bright morning, into the light. I want to leave you with the thing I most want understood, because it is the thing the story always loses in the retelling, and it is the only reason I have told it at all. The shock, the thing everyone said afterward, what happened next shocked everyone, was never the disarm. A disarm is only mechanics. Any of 100 men on that wall could have taken the rifle. The shock, the real shock, the one people felt in their bodies before their minds could name it, was that a thing which could have ended in blood, in a shot, in a trampled crowd, in a family destroyed, ended instead in nothing. No shot, no blood. No mark on any soul, not even on the man who caused it. A crowd walked home whole from the edge of a catastrophe, and the only evidence it had ever been near them was 2 seconds of footage they could not quite explain. That is the shock. Not that violence was met with greater violence. That violence was met with something violence cannot understand and cannot defeat. A discipline so complete that it disarmed the danger without becoming the danger, that protected everyone without harming anyone, that won so cleanly there was nothing left to see. People expect the strong man to win by being stronger. What shocked them was a stronger man who won by being gentler than he needed to be, on purpose, at speed, under the worst pressure a man can face, and who then simply stood back up and returned to his post as though the whole of it had been a part of the day's routine. That is the King's Guard, not the costume, not the stillness people mistake for emptiness. The King's Guard is the promise, kept in silence across 400 years, that between the good people of a kingdom and the recklessness that would harm them, there stands a man who has spent his whole life learning to protect them without ever letting them see how close the danger came. A man who sees everything and gives away nothing, who holds the whole library of violence inside perfect calm and opens it, when he must, only far enough to close the danger and not 1 inch further, and who asks, in return, nothing at all except to be allowed to stand his post and not be feared for the very discipline that keeps everyone alive. They gave me the small honor, and I wear it, and I am grateful. But the truest honor I was ever given came in a garden, from a woman with a boy on her hip, in a question I have never stopped answering in the quiet of my own mind. How do you carry it? Seeing everything all the time and standing so still that everyone thinks you see nothing. You carry it the only way it can be carried. You stand your post, you keep your stillness. You see everything and you say nothing and you give nothing away, and you build the safe ground in advance, every hour of every day, for a danger that will almost never come. And on the one afternoon in a decade when it comes anyway, You spend everything you have ever learned in 2 seconds no one will ever fully understand, and then you square your shoulders under the bearskin, and you set your eyes forward, and you go back to being the statue that sees everything. Because someone has to, and because standing between the good people and the storm, so quietly that they never know the storm was there, is not the lesser part of a soldier's life. It is the whole of it, it is the best of it. And I would not trade my gilded rail, my ordinary daylight, my 4 million good people having their small good days, for any dark and secret glory the world could offer, because here, in the light, once in a great while someone sees a king, a mother, a boy who will grow up never knowing and be safe. That is enough. That has always been enough. I am Aldous Vane, and I stand the king's post at the outer gate of Harrowgate, and if you come to see the changing on a fine gray afternoon, you will find me exactly where I have always been, eyes forward, chin level, the rifle on my right side, seeing every face in the crowd and giving away nothing at all. You will think I do not see you. I promise you that I do.